It's been a wild journey. There's no journey outward that will ever be as truly harrowing as the journey inward.
Well, I mean, we have one listener who will kill us if we don't ask you about this, and it's maybe a bit heavy for a 15-minute
Mm,
um, end to a podcast. But you're very candid about mental health, and I think this
yeah,
is something that luckily has come into public acceptance a lot more recently, partly catalyzed by COVID. I think by people really being wound up at home, enhancing people's sense of isolation and anxiety and health fears and even OCD tendencies. And also with the movements towards kind of a few public figures, public male figures that have committed suicide. Um, and I'm glad that this is something that you're you're being open about, because I think not enough people are. Can you talk to us a little bit about your background with this and
mm,
what's got you to where it is now?
yeah. Um, I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder, cyclical depression, in I don't know, I was 17 years old. And I didn't start talking about it publicly until half my life later. So I was 34, which I believe was 2015. And I wrote my first article about it, my very, very long essay on my struggle with depression and suicidal ideation. As of that writing, I had made 3 suicide attempts. And then there has been one since then, which was in like 2017-ish, I believe. And none since. And my depression is, I don't necessarily know that depression can be cured. If you had asked me 3 years ago, I would say like depression can't be cured. All of the work that I have done on myself to heal over the past several years has definitely affected the way that my depression manifests. I haven't had any real depressive, like deep, deep, deep depressive episodes where I have experienced weeks and months of suicidal ideation. I have had days where I've been depressed and I've had suicidal thoughts pop in. But where I am right now currently is feeling that a lot of the things that contributed to the depression have been addressed or resolved. Like many people, I I carried a lot of guilt for things that I had done, particularly in my previous relationships where there was infidelity in my marriage, and I just kept like judging myself for these. So I decided that for my healing, it would be best if I really dove in and started to unravel why I couldn't let go of this guilt and figure out ways to do that. And then in doing so was able to go back further and kind of see why these actions happened and why I was and I think that a lot of the guilt about these things was this fear that I would recreate those behaviors or patterns, and I'm no longer in that fear, so I no longer have that guilt. And so for me, treatment of depression is very much something that people need to address. You can just like wait it out. Eventually, the storm will pass, but that doesn't really help you. What I would suggest for people who are struggling with depression, particularly now, is do not isolate. Be willing to share it. If you're afraid to share it with the people in your life, share it with strangers. The thing that was the most helpful for me was, I mean, sharing with people in my life and not needing to hide it anymore was very, very helpful. But support groups, because it's very hard when you are sharing with someone in your life and telling them you're experiencing depression and suicidal ideation, and they're sitting there and they're like holding you and looking at you and they want to show up for you, and they say things like, oh, thank you for telling me, like I understand, and there's something in your head that immediately gets angry and you're like, you don't fucking understand. But being able to speak to people who do understand, people who, so support groups full of people who experience depression or suicidal ideation, there was something about that for me that was so very healing, to just be truly understood by someone else who'd experienced it. And those are usually full of strangers. It's not the people in your life, it's just other people. So, and there are a lot of those available via Zoom in the world of in the time of COVID. So the thing that I know universally does not help is just holding it inside. Whether you seek direct treatment with a therapist or whether you are going to support groups of some kind or sharing with the people in your life, and I think that like that's the trifecta. You should be doing all of those, but at least pick one and start working through it. And please know that my DMs are always open for people who are suffering from depression. I am available as soon as I see it to to at least hear you and hold space for you, and that might be enough. And if it is, I am here to do that for you. But I think that if you search mental health awareness as a hashtag on any of the big social media ones, you'll see that you're not alone, that so many people suffer from this. And I don't think that misery loves company applies to mental health disorders. I think it's more the case that suffering detests loneliness. And so finding companionship, finding understanding, finding people to hear you is it's not an option. It's the only thing that will universally not make things worse and probably make things better. Whereas isolation is probably the number one thing that will over time make things harder. So whether it's a therapist, a support group, people in your life, or just come out to the fucking internet like I did, just put it all out there. Um, People will be more supportive than you think. And there's going to be tons of people who don't know how to be supportive, and it'll be a fun adventure to try and figure out like what you actually need from the people in your life, but it's better than suffering in silence. So that's what I would say there. We can
I,
also have the conversation about how like psychedelics have been a tremendous part of that healing journey for me, but they're not required for anyone.
that is a much needed voice, I think, and especially where, particularly in the UK, I don't know what the mental health system is like in the US, but waiting times are ridiculously long. And even if you do go to your GP or you see somebody, a friend or a family member who can't relate, you either have the problem, as you said, of they haven't got the shared experience and they're not able to really hold that space, or in my case, if you've got time pressures and you're really seeing patients as part of um, a conveyor belt, and even if you desperately want to help them and even if you can relate, you just haven't got the resources and availability to, but it's kind of finding what are the things that are immediately accessible now for somebody to start making that move. The other thing you mentioned was you saw your depression almost as like an alarm bell, pointing to threads of past experiences, past behaviors, things in your life that you then started to unravel. Presumably psychedelics have had some role in helping you to uncover those.
Absolutely. The big thing, and this is probably not the very core of the depression, but the big thing was unveiling or sort of uncovering the fact that I had experienced sexual abuse as a child when I was between 6 and 8 years old at the hands of a relative, and
Wow.
I uncovered that during my second ever MDMA journey. And it wasn't like calling it a journey is very generous. It wasn't like I was with a shaman. I was like I was taking MDMA to like party with friends, and I was having a conversation. And this thread came up, and being held in this space of extreme sort of euphoria allowed me to uncover this thing that I had repressed for 20 some odd years. Um, and so then it took a really long time to like really work through a lot of that. But one of the things that psychedelics like acid and psilocybin and ayahuasca do is, as they dissolve the ego, you really get to look at things with a lot of objectivity. And when you're just in therapy and you aren't, you can, your ego will still, it's very sneaky. It'll come in the side door, the back door, and it'll give you these reasons you did these things that are justifications. Whereas when that ego is dissolved, or when you're deeper into therapy, and like you've got a great therapist like helping you work around the ego, and keep the ego out of the process, you begin to see the real reason that some of these things happened. And once you can resolve some of that, so an example in my case, something about like dishonesty in my life, particularly my romantic relationships, it kept coming up because I felt extremely unsafe to ever admit any desires or any wrongdoing, because when I was young, there was one occasion in particular where I did something wrong and my dad just like absolutely beat the shit out of me, broke two of my ribs. And so I had this habit of like, even if there's a 1% chance of that I'll get away with it, tell the lie.
Just like,
Tell the
yeah,
lie, because even if I'm going to get caught in the future, for today, I'll be safe. And so unraveling that and then realizing like, I'm a 38-year-old man, I'm 200 pounds. There's nobody in my life who is going to enact physical violence against me in any sort of way. And I could just say like, hey, I did this thing. I fucked up. And you know, most of the time people are I'm like, oh, that, yeah. I mean, it was weird how it would manifest, like little white lies. Like if I was going to be late to something, I'd have to concoct this story, and instead of just being like, hey, I was irresponsible and running late, and just like let that be a thing, because instead this fear of being perfect. But it really manifested in my romantic life, where I'd have these desires that I wouldn't feel safe to share, and then eventually suppressing them, of course, leads to acting out in some way, and then be, you know, and then you're just like, now I have to lie about this. And that's something that hasn't been present in my life for like 3 years now. And in the 2 years that I've been with Amanda, uh, there's never been an occasion when I've lied to her, and it's just like really cool to have something come up and sort of, hey, this is what's happening for me. And I wouldn't have been able to get there to see the real reason for it if it hadn't been for some the unconventional practices that I had used, because I might have just been like, well, I lie because I do bad things because I'm a shitty person. And then I lie because I don't want to hurt the other person. So I'm justifying the dishonesty by like, well, I can't tell them how shitty I am because then they'll leave, and I have this fear of abandonment. And what I really, and I'm protecting them. And so your ego just does all these like weird backflippy things. And so just being able to get to the root of why the dishonesty felt so necessary allowed me to stop, to forgive myself for previous dishonesty, to stop feeling guilty, then to let a lot of that go, and to not bring it, and to not be fearful of it happening again. And so just the energy that I'm saving by not trying to constantly fight that off in one space, and also not having to constantly like throw logs on the fire of self-loathing because of shit that I couldn't forgive myself for, frees up so much energy to just like be happy and live. And the psychedelics played a very crucial component with that. But I certainly do believe that you can get there through other means. My ego structure was just particularly wily.
that is amazing.
Yeah.
And the you're right that when, especially as someone who's experienced a lot of trauma and someone who's very intelligent, the ego can then be very powerful in either creating rationalizations or putting up the defenses or being very imaginative in ways that won't allow you to kind of address it head on. And as you said, working with someone or doing an extended meditation retreat or anything that involves like kind of um, cornering you to come up with this stuff is needed sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's been a wild journey. There's no journey outward that will ever be as truly harrowing as the journey inward.